Hello to everyone listening. I'm Jo Francis, Core & Bath's publishing manager, and today I'm talking to Hetty Verhagen about her new guide on child-to-parent violence and aggression. This is a new book in Core & Bath's popular Parenting Matters series, which looks at a range of conditions and experiences that may affect looked after children. Hetty is a lecturer at Leeds University and is in practice as a therapeutic social worker. She's also a former Core & Bath employee. So, Hetty, hello.
Hello there.
Your new book is on, as we've said, child-to-parent violence and aggression. Now, not everyone will have come across this. What does it mean?
So what we mean with child-to-parent violence and aggression is a child or young person who expresses their distress through ways that the adults, that their parents, that their carers experience as violent or aggressive. So it could be actually like hitting, kicking, spitting, but it could also be verbal aggression.
Right.
It could also be kind of bullying behaviours and controlling behaviours.
Okay, I see. So it's quite a range. It's more than just what we might think of as violence. Okay.
Yeah. People often, like so many people over the years have said to me, "Oh, my child's not, my child doesn't express themselves like this because I've never been hit. But
yes.
I feel like I have to walk on eggshells around them to make sure that like incidents don't explode."
Right.
So that we would see that as CPVA. So
Gotcha.
it's where you as a parent or carer feel that you have to adapt your behaviour around a child to avoid violence and aggression.
And what's your professional experience in this area? You say in the book that you've come across this in your social work practice.
Yeah, and I tell the story in the book of my very first independent social work visit was actually CPVA. So that was a situation where a young person had become really dysregulated and had kind of destroyed things in the house, been very verbally aggressive, threatened a parent, and the police had become involved.
Right.
And I just graduated, just landed in an adoption and special guardianship support team. I volunteered to go out on this kind of crisis visit. And as I was driving up, I was thinking, I haven't got anything. I've not learned anything about this at university. My life hasn't prepared me for this. And then I kind of kept coming across it and kept that feeling of, what do I do? I remember a parent in those early years saying, "Oh, what do I do when my child comes at me with a chair?" I remember just sitting there on their couch in the living room thinking, I don't actually know. What do you do when they come at you with a chair? So it's become something that I've been really interested in. And then over the years, as my experience and my therapeutic side of the work developed, that's kind of where most of my practice is. So I now tend to work a lot with families who are experiencing this.
Right, I see. And so it sounds like obviously you've had quite a lot of experience of this, but how common is this type of violence and aggression generally, but more specifically in fostered and adopted children, as this is the group you focus on in your book?
Yeah, so research about kind of general population suggests it affects about 2 to 5% of children. But in children who are looked after or previously looked after, I'm understanding that those percentages are a lot higher. So, for example, if we look at the Selwyn study into adoption disruptions, what we learned from that is that, really relatively few adoptions disrupt. But what they did find is that in that group of people, in about a third of people who say, we are really struggling, a lot of the time we're really struggling. And violence and aggression was a really prominent feature in that group of people.
Right.
So we know that this is more prevalent for children who are previously looked after.
Right, I see. And you say in the book also that this childhood aggression towards parents, it's a bit of a taboo subject. So it's a sort of thing maybe we don't know how much there is because it doesn't get talked about a lot. Parents and carers, they don't say anything, or perhaps not until the home situation starts to get a bit difficult. Why is it such a taboo?
I think there's different reasons for that. I think as a society, we really struggle to think about children as, being capable of this kind of behaviour. I think people feel that others might look at them like, what are you talking about? You're scared of your 5-year-old.
Yes, I'm laughing, but of course it's not funny. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's just what lots of people worry about. Or I think there's also the fear that if your child behaves in these ways, that maybe it reflects badly on you as a parent. Like, well, maybe you've been aggressive, or maybe you've just not been a very good parent, or maybe you're too permissive. And if you were a better parent, they wouldn't behave like this. I think that is part of the stigma. And then what I hear a lot as well from the families that I work with is that people just want to protect their child's reputation. People understand, adopters, foster carers, kinship carers, they often understand that it comes from the child's early experiences.
Yeah.
And they're just, they're aware of everything that the child has been through, and they don't want other people to think badly of them. So, the term child to parent violence and aggression could also include carers, obviously.
Yeah.
It kind of suggests that this behaviour very much happens at home. So school might not know about it. Family and friends might never see this behaviour. Yeah. So I suppose, people might think, well, at least if grandparents don't know about it, at least they won't blame the child, or...
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I can see. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to let this out, to start telling people about this for all sorts of reasons. But of course, this does mean that people often, parents and carers, they may not talk about this until things have got quite difficult in the home situation. Why is it so important to discuss this behaviour at an early stage?
I think, like everything really, it's much easier to start think about how you can help your child with this when things are not at a crisis stage, because then it's just really hard for everybody to be everybody involved to think about what might we be able to do. Yeah. Some families that I work with who where it is at that kind of crisis state, they're so exhausted, they're so stressed that it's if you want to talk to people about let me tell you why this is happening, and people might think, I just haven't got the capacity to think about that, I just need you to make it stop. And also with children, if they start to see themselves as I'm bad because I do this. So many children over the years have said that to me, like, I'm a really bad person because I hurt my mum, or because this thing that I said to my foster carer, and really children afterwards feel really guilty and ashamed of what they've done and what they've said, and the consequences of everything. So if you can start talking about it and thinking about how you might help a child earlier on, it just makes things a bit easier.
Yeah, I can see. It's difficult to talk about, but it's really better to get in sooner rather than later, as you say, before things become an emergency.
Yeah, and I've said quite a lot over the years that I wish we could just think of this as another kind of parenting, caring for children challenge.
So I imagine that it's child-to-parent violence, it can have a variety of causes behind it. What have you found to be some of the contributing factors in looked after children or those who've got this in their past?
That's a massive question, Jo.
Just a few of the contributing factors.
Yeah, I was going to say I've written a whole book about that.
Absolutely. Our listeners will have to buy the book to find out in full.
But basically, the way the approach of this book is that it's a very child-centred view of child-to-parent violence and aggression. So there's no blaming. There's no suggesting that this says something about the child's personality. We really look at CPVA as an impact of traumatic experiences, of earlier experiences. And what we often see with children who've had kind of the chaos and uncertainty and, you know, the trauma that looked after children often experience, and even just moving from one home to the other can be such a huge traumatic experience for a child. What we see is that lots of children then have a really strong need to control their environment.
Right, yes.
So that can be a contributing factor. Emotional immaturity can be a contributing factor. So children who, because of their experiences and their moves, have not been able to kind of develop emotionally in the way that a child who does have that stability would have been able to do. They may be lots younger emotionally than their actual chronological age.
Yes.
So we might think it's quite acceptable if a toddler kind of hits out in frustration.
Yes, that sort of toddler tantrum thing.
Yeah, but if a 10-year-old does it or a 12-year-old does it, then we probably judge it differently. But it might actually be that that's where they're at emotionally. Shame, lots of children who've experienced early trauma have a really, really heightened sense of shame. And I talk in the book about how CPVA can be kind of a defense mechanism against having that really awful feeling of shame. And I also talk a little bit about sensory issues, how sensory processing issues can contribute.
Right.
So it's a really complex.
Absolutely. Issue. Yeah, I can see there's a lot for people to consider here. Social workers, parents, carers, as you say. You've mentioned control issues. I can imagine this can be key for fostered and adopted children who may have had a traumatic, chaotic early life where they very much haven't been in control. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I look at CPVA as often a survival response.
Yeah.
And for children who've experienced what can happen when you're not in control of your environment.
Yeah.
You know, you can be scared, you can be hurt, horrible things can happen to you and to other people. Also, just being moved from one place to the other. That's one of the biggest ways that you can not be in control, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
That can be really traumatic for children. So when they then go on and they're hopefully in a much more stable, safer environment, being controlled by a parent or carer can feel really threatening. That feeling of I'm not in control of what's happening can feel like this is a threat. Anything might happen now. So sometimes that kind of violent and aggressive response is like a survival response to that feeling of threat when you're controlled. There's also the other side of the coin with control, so that it can be a response to, you know, it feels really uneasy when it feels like you're in control of me. It can also be, in order to feel safe, I need to feel in control. So children might have a really strict picture in their head of this is what this situation should look like. Because if it looks like this, like what it's like in my head, then it's safe. But then if it's really different, then suddenly it feels like, well, anything can happen now.
Yeah.
But children might get quite angry and might express that anger and that fear through violence and aggression when somebody's kind of not doing what they thought should happen, just because it feels really, really scary when that happens.
Yeah, and so different for what they may have become used to in their early years, I can see. Well, I'm sure many parents and carers will want to know what to do about CPVA. And again, obviously a great deal, I'm sure, could be said about this. Your book sets out a wide range of parenting strategies. Can you tell us a bit more about perhaps just a few of those?
Yeah, so like I said before, it's a very child-centered approach.
Yeah.
I'm not denying the impact that it has on parents. But in this book, I've tried to really think about what can parents and carers and also professionals who are working with children who express themselves through CPVA. How can they support a child? And one of the first stages, I think, is to help a child develop an awareness of their anger, of their responses. And I sometimes call that getting to know your anger when I work with younger children.
Right.
It's really the idea of destigmatizing anger and aggression and violence to kind of cut through that shame. So children, I talk in the book about how can you help them to realize actually anger itself isn't a problem. It's, we all get angry. It's just a human emotion. And then once they have that awareness, what does it feel like when I get angry? You can start to think about, so what other ways can you express that? And we talk about sensory interventions as well. So it's like a developing approach, really. It's not when they do A, you do B. It's more the approach is much more helping a child to understand why it's happening and what they can do differently.
Yeah, I see. Outside the family group, are there any sort of certain kinds of therapies or that sort of professional help that parents, carers and social workers could be thinking about? I mean, over and above the strategies that you set out.
Yeah, I think sometimes all the strategies that we talked about just now are kind of written like this is what you can do as a parent or a carer with a child. But sometimes it might be really helpful actually if somebody outside of the family, if a professional can do some of that work with the child, because sometimes just being in that kind of parenting, caring relationship itself can be really triggering for a child. So sometimes you need a professional to do that kind of thing. Yeah. What I hear from people is that people really appreciate MVR training to talk about child-to-parent violence, aggression in kind of group settings.
What's NVR, non-violent resistance?
Yes, absolutely non-violent resistance. Yeah, so that's often delivered in a group setting, and people tend to find that really helpful.
Okay,
but also other kind of groups for parents and carers where people can talk, like learn a bit about where does it come from, like we do in this book, and then people to share their experiences, because that helps destigmatize it. And once once people feel less ashamed, it's so much easier to start thinking about what can we do differently. Things that we often use in adoption, fostering, kinship, care support, like dyadic developmental psychotherapy, DDP.
Yes,
I think that can be really helpful. Also sensory support. I write a little bit about that in the book, about how if the violence and aggression comes from a sensory need, we need to address that first before we start looking at looking at other strategies. Because if a child kind of crashes into people because they need that sensory input, then there's no kind of awareness raising that's going to change that. We need to meet that sensory need first. So there's a whole range. And the final chapter of my bit of the book, because there's also the really great case studies written by parents.
Yes.
But the final bit of my book, I kind of go through a case study and, what might be helpful. And, we end up with this whole array of potentially helpful therapy strategies and support.
It's about addressing it from a range of different angles, I can see in the book. And it certainly made me think about the different levels, the different ways that you can approach something from trying to cover all of the different angles, basically.
Because this is something that affects a family. It's not like you've got a child with CPVA. No, as a family, you experience CPVA. So all members of the family might need support.
Finally, and perhaps following on from that, do you have any last message for parents, carers, and social workers when it comes to this subject? What's the sort of thing you'd like to say to people who are in this situation?
Yes, it's really, really hard to find yourself in that situation. So I guess my message would be that so many families I've worked with over the years feel that they're the only ones experiencing this. And I'd like people to know that they absolutely are not. I'd also like people to know that this is a developmental issue. It's not going to stay the same. We can never predict how it's going to develop, but we know that what you've got now is not what you're going to have in 5 years or 10 years' time. So sometimes people look at a 7-year-old and they say, oh my gosh, how are we going to cope if we've got this behavior when they're 15 or 16?
Yes.
And I always say, well, this is a developmental issue. So even though we don't know what it's going to be like when they're 15 or 16, it's not going to be like this. And I have seen children, move through CPVA, and, once they reach a different stage of development, they find other ways of expressing themselves, especially if people can use some of those strategies that we discuss. And I think one message that I feel really passionate about for people to understand is that a child who expresses themselves, who expresses their distress through CPVA, is the same child as the child who expresses their distress through crying, being shy, hiding under the table. The root cause is the same. It's just that it looks so different. And as adults, we find it really easy to go towards that child who's hiding under the table. And if a child is crying and they're frightened, we just have this really empathic response like, oh, come on and let me help you. And we're very gentle with we really want to help those children. The child who expresses those exact same feelings through hitting out or verbal aggression or, spitting at you, just because of our own survival response, we're much less likely to want to go towards that child. But I think if people understand that the cause of it is exactly the same, I think it'll be much easier for people to feel their empathy and to think, wow, this is a really upset child. It's not an angry child. It's a really frightened, upset, ashamed.
And a child who's trying to communicate with you.
Yeah, it's a child having a really big emotion, and at the moment, this is the only way that they can express that emotion.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. And thank you so much for talking to us about this subject. The book, I learned a great deal from working on this book. I'm sure parents, carers and social workers will also learn the same. And it's good to know that for people out there who are going through this situation, that there is hope, that you can work together with the child to make progress on this. Thank you very much, Hetty.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Jo. Thank you.